This is Jim Fetzer with James Fetzer News. My guest today, I'm very happy to say, is Dean Hartwell, author of Dead Men Talking, Truth Matters, and with me, a participant in what has turned out to be the longest thread in the history of the Education Forum, with over 2,000 posts contributed, which was devoted to Judyth Vary Baker living in exile. Dean, it's just a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Jim. It's wonderful to be here.
What was your take on the purpose of this thread?
My take was that you're presenting a very simple hypothesis, that you believe Judyth Vary Baker has been telling the truth about her experience in New Orleans many years ago, where she met Lee Oswald and participated in a controversial science experiment. And my take after that was expressed, after you wrote that into the thread, was that critics just came out right away on the first few pages saying that they didn't believe Judyth, they never would. One said that this was going to be his last post, and that was very early on, and he came back. And not really a whole lot of substance to what they were saying. I was looking for maybe a dialogue, maybe a discussion, but we got a monologue out of many of them.
Let me ask you this, Dean. Did I present any evidence? Did I offer any sources? Did I suggest where they could go and learn more to evaluate my case?
Yes. Certainly at the top of the list will be Dr. Mary's Monkey, a book by Ed Haslam. And you also had a number of YouTube videos, which are available for anybody to see. And there are web pages as well, which show pictures or photographs of documentation that help verify what Judyth is saying. And I just didn't hear a whole lot back from the critics as to this presentation of evidence, or maybe more importantly, what evidence they were looking for.
Yes, I quite agree with that. I never got the impression of what evidence would convince any of them of any aspect of Judyth's story. I mean, such concessions as were made were extraordinarily modest. Jack White, for example, would agree that she was a talented science student,
Okay.
but it didn't go much beyond that.
No, it was tough to watch. They would bring up what I would call collateral issues that weren't directly related to Judyth meeting Lee or having a relationship with him, or the lab work that she did, and also other people that she met, like David Ferry. They would instead bring up, and I'll just say one example, the issue of asylum. I think was repetitive. They brought it up over and over again, and I never heard a clear explanation as to why this was so important to our discussion.
I think that's a great point, because it must have come up, I don't know, dozens, literally dozens of times. And I responded to it by pointing out that if the critics' position were well-founded, that Judyth couldn't possibly have stayed in Sweden as long as she did, which meant it was false on its face. And Judyth had, friends of hers who were trying to figure out how this person could have obtained information that was not public. It was all very curious.
Right. I just wondered about some of the things they would bring up, but I would certainly read it. But again, just one collateral issue after another, and it just seemed no holds barred. Personal attacks were made quite often, it seemed, on Judyth and on you as well. And it got to be kind of a free-for-all after a while.
It did. Now, did you ever get a clear sense of what they might have accepted as independent corroborated evidence, for example? Because no matter how many posts I made, no matter how many evidence, photographs, documents, diagrams, what have you, it seemed to me they never conceded any of those points, not a single one.
No, and you're right. And I asked one of them, okay, what is an example of independent corroborative evidence? I got no reply. And I asked another one, you say that Judyth has no bona fide witnesses. Please give me an example of what a bona fide witness would be or is. No reply.
And of course, that was particularly relevant because she had mentioned how Anna Lewis and her husband David had accompanied her and Lee on double dates, including one to the 500 Club in downtown New Orleans, where Carlos Marcello ran the shop, and how Lee had even introduced them to Carlos.
Right. And I think, Jim, to add to that frustration about the evidence is I do not believe that any of them really put themselves in Judyth's position. That is to say, Judyth admitted that she had an affair with Lee Oswald. And people having an affair, I just don't think they're going to want other people to take photographs of them or provide or have much documentation of them for obvious reasons. But I didn't hear empathy or an understanding that the amount of evidence at this point is just not going to be overwhelming.
Did you find anything implausible about Judyth's explanation of how she was drawn into coming to New Orleans by Alton Ochsner, who was the president of the American Cancer Society, a very noted researcher in his own right, who suggested that if she were to come and participate in these projects, that he'd gain her early access to medical school with scholarship support?
I found it to be plausible. When I was in high school, I'm sure I would have loved to have heard some very, very famous individual give me that sort of an offer. And I know that there are students who have excelled, as Judyth did, and has been documented, who have received offers such as those. So, no, it wasn't implausible to think that she would go from Florida eventually to New Orleans and to meet the people that she says she did.
Fortuitously, after Judyth left Sweden recently, she visited London with two close associates of mine, Declan and Lola Heavey, and I had the opportunity to make multiple YouTubes and even several 2-hour programs for The Real Deal. Did you have the chance to review any of that, Dean?
I read all of them, and I like the videos. I think, one moment was very interesting. She was describing meeting Lee, and she talked about how he pronounced the word New Orleans. He pronounced it New Orleans or something
New Orleans.
Like that.
New Orleans.
It didn't sound contrived. It just sounded like she was really recalling a moment.
Yeah, how he had corrected her when she said New Orleans, and he said, well, down here we pronounce it New Orleans. And yet when he was interviewed on television, just as a signal to her, he deliberately pronounced it her way, New Orleans, said it 5 or 6 times, and one of them actually came across on the television, and he said, you see, her influence on him.
Right.
Stories like that, Dean, I found so convincing, and it just turned out that she heard from a former classmate at the University of Florida, one of the few in whom she'd confided that she was going to New Orleans, who had asked her what had happened, how come she hadn't pursued the medical career that she had known she was eager to pursue at Tulane.
Yes, was that Kathy?
Yeah, Kathy.
Yes, I did recall saying something about that, right. Yes.
Her name was Kathy. She became a doctor herself, and she was asking Judyth very specific questions that implied her understanding of Judyth's plans when she went to New Orleans.
Right. So, again, there's independent corroboration. And again, I'd ask critics, what do you want? What game are we playing here? Are we playing poker? Are we playing hearts? Let's call it.
It seemed, toward the end, I put up a series of 5 rather powerful posts, one about Alton Ochsner, one about, a visit out to Clinton Jackson, another about a handwriting sample. It seemed to me that in the midst of these 5 powerful posts, one particularly important about the disappearing witness, Dean, that was one of the most important of all, in my opinion, because here's where a mystery person, a woman who was in a car from which Lee Oswald had apparently emerged to get a haircut, and then later where he drove up to meet a state representative about the possibility of getting a job at a local hospital, was observed by his daughter, Mary Morgan. And this made it into the early record, and then you could see as it was a subsequent investigation would take place, her presence disappeared.
It did. And that was just really great information, considering that the district attorney in the Clay Shaw trial was mentioning that somebody saw Oswald with another woman, not Maureen Oswald. I mean, it's right there on the record, and anybody can go to it and check it out.
So would you agree that if anyone wants to learn about Judyth, it's valuable to look at these YouTubes and the interviews, where you can go to jamesfetzer.blogspot.com or go to radiofetzer.blogspot.com. But Dean, as an overall assessment, you have made the observation, suppose we use these individuals as members of Judyth's jury. What would be your impression?
I'd have to dismiss a good many of them for cause because they brought prejudice with them against Judyth.
I've never seen a less open-minded group in my life, Dean. 2,000 posts later, I got to say, I don't think anyone changed their mind. Dean Hartwell, I can't thank you enough for being on the show with me. Always a pleasure, and I'm so glad you were there to participate, too.
It's a pleasure, Jim.